If you'd like to connect to a database in your Python program and do some kind of inserts, deletes, or updates, the first thing you need to do is establish a database connection. And in order to do that with Python, you need to install connector/python, which is a MySQL component based on the DB-API standard from the Python Software Foundation. So to set up your Python program for database programming, there's a few steps that you need to do. First thing is install the connector/python. In the description of this video, I have the link from MySQL on where to install the connector/python for your Python programming environment. And once that's established, the first thing you need to do in your actual Python program is import it. So you'll right at the top, import mysql.connector from mysql.connector, and then import error codes, which is going to handle any kind of exception handling. So then the next thing is inside a try block within your Python program, you will establish your database connection. And in this example, we have db_connection is assigned to mysql.connector.connect. So this connect method is going to send our database credentials over and authenticate and connect us to our MySQL database. So I made up a username and password, and you'll also need the host where the database resides and the name of the database you want to connect to, because a host can have multiple databases on there. Once it authenticates your database, you'll be connected and you'll be able to interact and do inserts, deletes, and updates to your database. However, if there's any kind of error, it'll go to this except block during your exception handling, and it'll let you know with a print statement whether your credentials were invalid, whether the database was not found, or it just couldn't connect to the database for whatever reason. And then in the else, that is where we will have all our Python code to interact with the database, but make sure when you're done working with the database to close your database connection with the close method. After you've created a database connection in your Python program using connector/python, the next thing you can do is start executing queries, creating tables, or whatever it is you need to do in your database. So the MySQL.Cursor class creates a cursor object that can execute SQL statements and also store the results. And the cursor object has lots of useful database methods. So let's take a look at this example. And by the way, this is just a partial example, not a full program. But just wanted to show you guys what the code would look like. Let's say db_connection was your database connection. By calling the cursor method, that'll create the cursor for the database connection object. And it's the same cursor that's used for all your SQL statements for that database connection. And we're storing that in movie_cursor. And the next statement, we're setting create_movie to a create table statement, where we're creating a movie table and making that the primary key, setting the name and rating for this movie table. And then the next thing that we do is back on the movie cursor object, we're calling the execute method and passing our create movie, which was our create table statement. And the execute method executes the SQL statements that are passed as a string parameter after they're compiled. And then in movie query, we're creating an insert statement where we're inserting the movie Scarface with ID 100 and rating R. And so far, we're not doing anything except creating the string, but then we're passing that same movie query string to that execute method again. But before any changes are actually saved, we'll call the connection.commit method, which will save the result of the SQL statement, such as your inserts like we did in this example, deletes, or updates. And then when you're done doing all the things that you needed to do with your database, make sure you close the cursor connection, which releases and closes the cursor object. And this should be done after any commit or rollback, but before closing the actual database connection, which will come later. When you are database programming with Python, it's a great idea to use query parameters, which are used to substitute Python values in a SQL statement. So if you had an insert string and you provided the actual data in the string, then your SQL statement is vulnerable to a SQL injection attack, where SQL injection is a code injection technique that's used to attack data-driven applications, and malicious SQL statements are inserted into the entry field for execution. And just to prevent any kind of security issue like that in your program, let's take a look at an example of how to use query parameters. So in this example, we are receiving input for a movie's ID, the name of the movie, and the rating. And those are stored in the variables ID, flick, and rating. And then we create the cursor for the database connection. And then in movie_query, that is the insert string that we're going to execute on our database. But notice that rather than inserting the actual values in the parentheses after the word values, instead of having ID, comma, flick, comma, rating there, we're using placeholders instead, which are going to get substituted with the data later on when we execute it. So in the next line of code, movie_data, that's being assigned to the tuple of data which we received from user input. And then finally, we're calling movie_cursor.execute, where we're passing in the insert statement string, which concluded the placeholders, followed by a second argument which contains the movie data, the ID, flick, and rating tuple. And then we commit the changes so that the insert is on our database, and then close the cursor when you're all done. Fetch methods access the query results of select statements when you call the cursor.execute method. And there's two main methods that you're going to use. The first one is cursor.fetch1, which returns a tuple containing a single row result. It returns none if there are no rows selected. And if there are many rows, cursor.fetch1 can be executed in a loop until none is returned and the loop ends. And then there's also cursor.fetchAll, which returns a list of tuples containing the results of all the rows. And you can also loop through the tuple list to process it. So in the example shown here, we are first creating our cursor for the database connection object. And then we created a movie query string where we're selecting the name and price from an Amazon movie where the rating is set to a placeholder and the year is also greater than or equal to a placeholder using query parameters. And then we execute this statement, and movie_cursor.fetchAll will grab the entire result set. But for each row in that result set, we're printing movie followed by row at index 0, which is going to be the name. Costs, $, row at index 1 is going to be the price. So from our select statement, we're selecting two things, name and price. When you're finally done retrieving all your rows of data and doing what you need with the database, make sure to close and release the cursor object.